presence is the process through which we actually become productive, right? If you're trying to do something, if your intention is to do something, and we all have moments like this, often we can't muster the presence to do that. We can't show up. Our mind is resisting the task, maybe because it's at a lower stimulation height, whatever the reason, right? And the fact of the matter is, presence is what productivity is all about, right? That is where the rubber meets the road. And so much, I'd say 70, 80, maybe even 90% of productivity, maybe 80% of productivity advice is about cultivating the conditions for presence. It's about managing your time, your attention, your energy, which I consider to be the three main ingredients with productivity. It's managing those in a way that you cultivate the conditions to be able to show up to whatever it is that you intend to do.
Those wise words are from author and researcher Chris Bailey. Now, in an anxious world, the path to productivity runs directly through calm. That is the hypothesis that Chris gets to in this particular episode of the Chase Jarvis Live Show. It's incredible to understand the relationship that we have through all these neurochemicals, how we are able to calm ourselves. And if we do, not only are we more productive, but we actually live a richer life full of more meaning. If that's for you, this episode is too. Chris, we did it. Welcome to the show, man.
We've done it.
We have done
We
it.
have done it, haven't we?
That is it for the day. Have a good day,
All
everyone.
right.
Goodbye.
Thank you for coming to the podcast.
Welcome. And today we're going to talk about a lot of things. Where we're going to open the show is anxiety is an all-time high. And you have written about this at length, which is going to be extremely valuable for our community. But before we go into the details of your work, some of your previous books, the most recent one, I would love for you to introduce yourself. It's a great way for our audience to hear how you orient yourself in pop culture, in say some of the things that are important to you, why you are on the show. Just give us a little intro.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for having me on. And my name is Chris Bailey, and I am an author of books on productivity. And I have a couple of them out. One of them is called The Productivity Project. The other one is called Hyperfocus. And I have a third one out now called How to Calm Your Mind. And I am fortunate that I get to be a huge nerd for a living. I write about this stuff that I am deeply curious about. I let passion and curiosity drive pretty much everything that I do, even at the expense of making money. And I'm fortunate that I just get to keep doing this and experiment and dive into the research on these topics that I love so much. So, hi, I'm a huge nerd and I like to write books.
Well, I love that. One self-identified nerd. With this,
Yes.
before we get into the topics of these books, productivity. See, when I
Yeah.
think of you, I think of productivity, but it's got like there's always a twist. And the most recent book, again, How to Calm Your Mind. We're going to get into
Yeah.
that in a bit. But
Hmm.
before we do, I'm going to put a pin in that and say, okay, you said something interesting in the intro, which is going to be valuable for our listeners or watchers, and that is I get to do what I love.
Yeah.
You get to go deep and follow your curiosity. And
Hmm.
one of the ways that I sometimes like to open the show is to understand, how did you discover both the things that you love and that you could actually do them for a living?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know I could do this for a living initially. So I graduated from university with a few full time job offers. And luckily in Canada, we can defer our student loans for a year. And I thought, okay, I'm actually going to take advantage of this little deferring program that we have. So I declined those jobs right after graduating university. I'd done some internships and stuff up to that point where I had this real world experience that I got these job offers from. But I thought, if there's ever a time to actually experiment with something that I'm deeply curious and passionate about, it was then. So decline the jobs to make zero money for a living, to dive as deep into this world of productivity advice as I could. And what was the impetus for that? Some people are blessed with normal interests. Some people are into sports, photography, music, writing. I have always been obsessed with this idea of becoming as productive as possible. I'm quite lazy. Laziness drives a lot of what I do, so I like to find the shortest path to get to the destination that I want without compromising on anything along the way. So laziness drives what I do, but also the fact that we only have so much time each and every day to work, to live, to find meaning, to connect with other people, to do work that we're proud of. And so I want to optimize that, given that is such a constraint of our lives over the arc of time. And so it's always been this curiosity. And so I declined the jobs and started what became the book, The Productivity Project. And it was very much a circular project at the time, right? Being productive, writing about productivity. But I was able to begin separating out the fluff from the stuff that actually allows us to make progress. And that prioritization has served me through today. These days, it's more looking at the academic literature, it's talking to experts to solve the problems that I'm going through myself, like anxiety, like burnout, like being unable to focus, which was the subject of the second book. And so it's curiosity that drives. So it was that initial risk. It could have
Yeah.
easily not turned out. And declining a few jobs to start a blog for a year, which is what it was at the time. It's not a decision that you can easily explain to grandparents, to parents, to relatives, to a lot of people considering it. But I think it's one of those situations where the greater the risk, often the greater return, and often the best decisions are the ones that don't make sense when they're made because the conditions will align down the future to make that decision make sense, and that is precisely what makes it valuable.
And that sounds like that worked out reasonably well for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think people connected with this approach of being vulnerable. One of the things that bugs me about productivity advice is when somebody has their pedestal and they have this holier than thou mentality. Oh, you should listen to me. I am a guru. I am a thought leader. Bow down. I've never really been into that kind of approach because we're all human, we're all fallible, we all struggle with this stuff, and so I like to talk about those struggles and try to overcome them, often in public.
Well, that is the perfect entrance into the work, because one of the things that I found the most valuable about your recent work, again, the book title is called How to Calm Your Mind,
Yeah,
is, as I referenced earlier in our opening, is anxiety.
yeah,
And you have been really, really transparent with all your work, and you just, doubled down on that by saying, like, I'm not here to be free from this and to give you advice that will, that is guaranteed to work 100% of the time.
yeah,
And so my entree into this material is going to be, why did you write about anxiety and how to contrast that anxiety with making your mind calm such that
yeah.
you can do the things that you want to do in a productive and meaningful way.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. Do the things that you want to do. In exploring this topic of productivity, I've come to realize that what lives at the heart of productivity, it's not about hustling, doing more, 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 faster, faster, faster. It's about doing the right things deliberately, and it's really intentionality that lies at the core of productivity. But what you'll find is the more anxious you become, the less productive you also become. A good example or illustration of this is if I told you, okay, Chase, you have to give an important presentation to these 5,000 people in half an hour. But, before you do you mind, reading this report that I have prepared for you on something that's totally different? You're probably going to find it difficult to focus in the moment and be present with that report when you have that upcoming threat, that upcoming presentation that you have to do. Airline turbulence is another kind of situation where when we hit a pocket of airline turbulence, we often have to rewind the movie we're watching or reread the last few paragraphs of the book that we're reading or remember what window we're browsing in on our computer when we hit that threat. And anxiety has a comparable effect on our mind where it shrinks our cognitive capacity and leads us to get significantly less done. And often it sneaks up on us where it's kind of like boiling a frog in reverse. I don't know if that analogy makes sense now that I think of it, because how can you boil something? But anyway, it's kind of like if your cognitive capacity is like 100% today, and next week it's 99%, and the week after it's 98%. You're still functioning on a relatively full load, but it diminishes slowly over time. And anxiety is kind of a similar way where this undercurrent of anxiety that permeates its way through our life. We're always looking for threats when we're in that threat finding mentality, which shrinks our cognitive capacity, but does so slowly over time, which leads us to become far less aware that we're anxious in the first place. And this is something that I found in my own work and in my own life. It boiled over for me when I was on stage giving a presentation in front of about 100 people. I got up on stage and I noticed maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes into my talk that beads of sweat started to form on the back of my neck, kind of that little crook there. And at the same time, I felt as though there were a dozen marbles in my mouth that my tongue had to dance around. And all the meanwhile, I kind of got dizzy at the same time and realizing in that moment I was having an anxiety attack on stage. I was in this fight, flight, or freeze response. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I wanted to leave and not come back. And it was very much that boiling a frog in reverse. I'm doubling down on this analogy,
Go
Chase,
for it. Lean
doubling
into it.
down, leaning into it. Uh, I didn't notice it was sneaking up on me until it was too late, until I perceived a talk, which I do all the time for work, as this threatening event that my mind and my body couldn't mobilize to overcome. And that was the original impetus that set me on the course to write this book, How to Calm Your Mind. I remember after this event, I was in the hotel room. It was one of those hotel rooms that has two beds, even though it's just you staying there. I don't know how many people use these rooms with two beds, one for the luggage, one for you. And I remember just lying down on one of the beds thinking like I am not in a good place right now and I don't know what needs to change. I don't know really what is happening. A- and I didn't form an entire picture of what was happening. I didn't have the awareness to do so at that time. But this was the impetus in realizing that something needed to change that led me through the research on anxiety, on burnout, led me to talk to experts and researchers around the world, led me to conduct experiments on myself to look at the actual research. Because not to go on too long with this answer, but I was investing in a lot of self care strategies at the time. And I actually thought I was doing a really good job of it. I was meditating every day. I was taking baths on the road. I'm a big bath kind of fella. I love, ordering takeout food when I'm on the road. I go to the spa with my wife. I thought I was doing a good job of self care, but yet that anxiety metastasized into a full blown anxiety attack on stage. And that disconnect is what sparked this project. I didn't intend to write this book, but I'm grateful for the journey that I went on. And I felt I needed to share these ideas in the hopes that they help other people as much as they've helped me.
Well, this thank you for sharing that, first of all, because the way that we come to work is always it's always fascinating to me. The creative person that I am, I'm fascinated how we choose to do the things that we choose with our time,
Yeah.
and also this how universal your challenges are.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the thing about creative work, right? We these things are deeply personal to us because you experience that fright, that pain, the anxiety on stage, the anxiety attack, and yet there are, I'm going to say, thousands of people who are listening or watching right now that have gone through the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one, this is a message that in what is it, the James Joyce, in the particular lies the universal. So in your case,
Mm,
you
that's a
you have,
beautiful quote.
yeah, you have done this work. Presumably, I was going to say that we don't have to do it, but the book that you have created on this, again, the most recent one, How to Calm Your Mind, one of the
Yeah.
things that I love is the tools.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
makes me want to go, before we go to the tools, just let's do a little bit of background
Yeah.
on sort of neurochemically,
Yeah.
what are the components of anxiety, and how does modern life basically is a farm for these
Yeah.
anxiety chemicals. Before we solve them, let's understand a little bit more about the problem that we are all dealing with.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so true. And I think that's one of the most remarkable parts about my own story is just how unremarkable it is, how universal it is, especially when the modern world that we find ourselves in is not structured around calm. It's about the pursuit of more. The pursuit of more winds itself through so much of what we do. And so does the pursuit of stimulation. And those 2 factors, the fact that, and the those 2 factors have a common neurological underpinning, which is dopamine. And dopamine is a very misunderstood neurochemical. And I think, looking at the research on dopamine, looking at the journal articles on it, I think anybody that pretends to fully understand this chemical isn't really admitting, that we don't understand the whole picture. The research doesn't understand the whole picture. And dopamine is essential to living a good life. Our body needs it to function. And we also release dopamine when we do creative work, when we're focused on something, when we're making progress on something. But we release other chemicals alongside these activities that lead us to a presence in what we're doing, like serotonin, which leads us to feel proud of what we've done, oxytocin, which leads us to feel connected with other people, endorphins that lead us to a rush, like when we go for a run or do a stretch or have a good cry. Um, these are what make us feel human. But dopamine, the best research that I found on it, so I should preface it by saying that, has found that dopamine is a chemical not of pleasure. We think of dopamine as a pleasure chemical, but in practice, it is what leads us to feel as though pleasure is almost there. It's a chemical of anticipation that drives us forward. And there's even a mechanism in our mind called the novelty bias, by which for every new and novel thing we direct our attention at, our mind rewards us with a spritz of this neurochemical. So we wake up, we hop over to Instagram, we get a hit of dopamine. We feel as though pleasure is on the way, and so we continue on. Maybe we check email after that. We get another spritz of the chemical. Then after that, we go back to Instagram. Then we check Twitter. Then we check the news, bouncing around in this dopamine fueled feedback loop. But what this does is this leads our mind to be overstimulated. And what we always want to do, we always want to stay at the same level of stimulation as we currently are. And so if we start our day off, you just as an experiment, this is something that everybody can try. Speaking of that tactical level, for 1 week, have your phone by your night on your nightstand. Have it wake you up. Turn on notifications. Deal with what comes in the morning, and then the week after that, just buy an old-fashioned alarm clock, or maybe wake up to your smart speaker if you trust that, or the smart device on your wrist, and have a book on your nightstand instead. And for until maybe 8 a.m., don't connect to the internet, and see the difference in stimulation level and what the difference that makes in how you work and how you live and how much presence you have with the world around you. If it's intentionality and deliberateness that lies at the core of what it means to be productive, these calm mornings really do lead us to deliberate days, right? When we start the day off on a calm note, we stay at that calm note and we find it easier to become present in whatever we're doing. But it's this constant craving for more that's built around the neurochemical dopamine, as well as this constant need for stimulation, especially the super stimuli that we are surrounded by, which are highly processed versions of things that we're biologically wired to enjoy. So, pornography is a highly processed artificial version of something of intimate time with a partner which we're biologically wired to enjoy. Takeout food is this artificially created, salty, sugary, fatty thing that is an artificial version of something that grows in nature. You know, the sweetness of berries, for example. A lot of super stimuli on the internet. The news is a highly, often artificial novel. Novelty is cranked through the roof with the news version of something that we're wired to enjoy, which is, anything that directly we perceive as directly affecting our life. And so it's a complicated picture, and it's one that I've fortunately had several years to deconstruct, especially in the book. But this pursuit of dopamine provides the neurochemical underpinnings of this modern day anxiety. But this anxiety in the first place is also a fascinating phenomenon, especially as calm is related. Because when I started searching for calm in writing this book, I was looking for a definition from the research. But one of the most fascinating things that I found in this pursuit of calm is that calm is not something that is studied by researchers. It doesn't have a commonly agreed upon clinical definition. But the best evidence that we do have about this topic shows that calm is the polar opposite of anxiety. And in fact, these two phenomenon exist on the same spectrum as one another. So, by default, what going into this research process, I thought of anxiety as something we either have a lot of or we have none of. But in fact, it exists on a spectrum along with calm. So high anxiety is on one side of the spectrum, and high calmness is on the other side of the spectrum. So we can go past the point of having no anxiety to acquire more calm, to have a not only a less stimulated mind by all the things in the world that stimulate us, but also by relating to that lack of stimulation in a positive way. That's what calm is, those two factors, stimulation versus that relation to our thoughts. Um, you know, in bringing calm into our life, we develop more of a resilience, a capacity for taking on stressful things in the first place. And it's this fascinating idea that was so delightful to uncover.
This is so. I'm going to interject here because this the capacity, um, the human capacity, the potential that we have if we're on this sort of anxiety calm spectrum, and
Yeah,
essentially our potential has to be then on the other side of navigating this thing, because
yeah,
if we are anxious and we are in fight or flight or
yeah.
uh,
Freeze.
freeze,
Yeah,
um, there's no way to be our best. Now,
yeah.
living anxious free or anxiety free is also probably not a reality, because there's a reasonable biological underpinning for at least some
Oh, yeah,
anxiety. Like we're social
yeah,
creatures. We do need to, fit in. We also, as creators and entrepreneurs, we do need to stand out. And there's tension there, and so there's plenty
yeah,
of tension in there. But I think, my understanding of your work is that we want to be intentional about this.
yeah,
So if anxiety is sort of throws the brakes on it, calm,
yeah,
it gets us closer to our potential or our awareness, our ability to focus and be in the moment.
yeah.
Focus being some of your earlier work.
Mhm.
Why, give me a why, why is calm so effective? You just went through this
Yeah,
neurological of why
yeah,
anxiety is bad. Let's do
yeah,
the opposite. Why is calm good?
yeah,
Because I
that's
think
such
there's a lot of people out there that, like, oh, when I'm pumped up, that's when I'm gonna be at my best. And when I'm angry at the other team or one of my
yeah.
teammates, that's gonna, it's like, but
Yeah,
why is if these are on the same spectrum, then you know why is calm good for human potential?
yeah. There is something there, where we do need to be fired up. This is not an argument against being fired up. And often what leads us to calm in the longer arc of the time of time is what leads us to present in the present moment. It's anything that leads us to feel proud and connected in addition to stimulated, mentally stimulated. So there is this disconnect between these different kind of layers of time where what leads us to this accomplishment over the long arc of time and this satisfaction with our life is what leads us to present in the present moment. And you actually see this in the subject of burnout too. And I think there's a relationship with stress here as well. So we essentially have two types of stress that we face throughout the day. And folks have probably heard of these types of stress before. We have acute stress, which is the once off stress that's annoying to get through, but once we get to the other side of it, we're done. It's the once off vacation that we have to that we're late for. It's the Thanksgiving meal we're cooking for our family. It's the thing that's going wrong that we grow from later on. And acute stress is fascinating because if you were to go back through your life and eliminate all of these sources of acute stress, the things that fire you up in the moment and that lead you to grow, you'd probably remove much of the meaning from your life too. If you took out the stressful events, there goes your wedding. There goes your honeymoon. There goes, the loss of a loved one that was painful, but that you grew from and became a different and better person. There goes your growth. There goes your meaning. Acute stress sucks when we're in it, but it's kind of like, there's a quote from Sonia Lyubomirsky, I think, where she said that vacations are not perfect, but we remember them as perfect. I think a similar thing can be said about acute stress, where it's never great when we're in it, but we look back on it as a meaningful element of our life. So there's acute stress, and then there's the chronic stress, the stuff that never ends. Instead of the financial hardship from a recession that's once off that we got through and grew from and built a more resilient business and career, it's the constant financial concerns we have whenever we open our bank account. Instead of the once off argument that led us to grow, it's the irreconcilable feelings we have when we see our partner or a loved one. And this is the danger when it comes to engagement and burnout, especially. Burnout is a phenomenon that is caused by one thing and one thing only, and that is chronic stress. And burnout, in fact, is defined as the ultimate manifestation of chronic stress, especially in a workplace type of environment. Of course, we get burnt out because of the chronic stress that comes from home, our home life as well. And that's the danger, I think, especially when we face so many hidden forms of chronic stress. So, you can break it down further within that chronic stress. Acute stress, meaning, but chronic stress is not good. We can kind of break it down between the sources of it, though, that are obvious and that are hidden. The things that are threats to our mind that we turn to because of dopamine, kind of connecting this to what we were just chatting about.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm looking to
And
make that connection.
yeah, and so the news is a really good example of this. We often pay attention to the news by choice, refreshing it throughout the day, even though our ancient mind perceives that as a threat. There's one study I encountered over the course of writing How to Calm Your Mind that was conducted on the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. And the team of researchers looked at two groups of people. The first group of people were runners in the marathon. And the second group of people were those who watched 6 or more hours of news coverage about the Boston Marathon bombings. And what the researchers found was that those who watched the news coverage, not who were in the marathon, experienced more stress from the event and were more likely to suffer from post traumatic stress disorder than somebody who's in the marathon and personally affected by it. Um, Social media is a similar phenomenon where we choose to pay attention to it. But if you break down the proportion of stimuli on social media that your mind perceives as a threat, it's a relatively high proportion of things. It's updates that conflict with our values that lead to engagement because we're fired up and angry over them. But the fascinating thing, to go back to the original question, we're on a little journey here, I
No, this is
guess.
beautiful. I love
Yeah,
it.
to go back to the original question, burnout is a fascinating phenomenon because it too exists on a spectrum. So, burnout is a phenomenon that has three characteristics associated with it. We're exhausted, we're cynical, and we're unproductive. And these three attributes of burnout, we need all three to be fully burnt out. Exhaustion is not burnout, as I found it. That was a surprising lesson for me too, in diagnosing my own situation. We also need to feel cynical and unproductive, and as though we feel like what we're doing doesn't make a difference. So these three are stepping stones to a full burnout phenomenon. But the opposite of burnout is engagement.
Mm.
So when you flip those three characteristics around, instead of exhausted, we're fired up. Instead of feeling like we're not making a difference, like we're unproductive, we feel as though we're moving things forward. Instead of being cynical, there is a light in what we do and in what we create. And that's the fascinating thing is we over time, because we have this hidden chronic stress in our life, we move closer towards the burnout side of the spectrum automatically without awareness that we are. It's another one of these, I'm doubling down yet again, Chase, boiling this frog in reverse. These little things that sneak up on us over time. And really overcoming chronic stress in this way, it doesn't just lead us to get away from burnout, it also leads us to that engagement, which over the longer arc of time leads us to calm. Because in the moment, what leads us to become present with what we're doing, what leads us to that flow like state where we're fully focused on whatever's in front of us or whomever is in front of us, that leads us to calm overall because that causes a more balanced release of neurochemicals in our mind. And so it's really about the longer arc of time. It is a complex picture that does involve burnout, but there is that connection with chronic stress
Yeah.
that causes anxiety and burnout at the same time. And so I think what we're optimizing for is that engagement in the moment that leads to a presence and calm and deliberateness overall. And we feel like there's meaning behind what we do when that's the case.
Yeah, there's this neurochemically, we could sort of define the cocktail, but I
Mhm.
think that everyone who's listening has experienced that flow state, a sense of
Yeah.
connectedness and a sense of meaning. And if we really are chasing that, and again, at the core of your work is this intention, like
Yeah.
that is the rationale for seeking calm, because calm is connected to those times where you are the most connected, where you are the most fulfilled and productive, and flow
Yeah.
states come more easily. Um, Question here. This isn't meant to be a curveball, but I'm also like, there are people who are listening
Yeah.
who, or yeah, maybe even we can include this up front in the show today, because there are people who don't believe. There are other people in my life that I have heard say these things, like, yeah, I don't, I'm not really anxious, or I don't feel
Yeah.
anxiety, and I observe that they are categorically full of shit. Like, I observe it. I'm like, you can't act
Yeah.
like that and not be anxious or stressed out. And so, in an
Yeah.
attempt to reach as many people in for today's show as possible,
Yeah.
help us understand how they can get into the work when they
Yeah.
don't perceive that they have, I'll call it an anxiety problem. Maybe
Mhm.
maybe in another frame, it's where they have a lack of productivity or a lack of meaning, or maybe there's some
Mhm.
other words that you can attribute to it. But we need to help. My belief is that 99% of the population is struggling here. So help us lasso
Yeah.
everyone here.
Yeah. You know, this book doesn't cover clinical anxiety. The clinical anxiety, if you do feel like you have an anxiety disorder, it's definitely something to seek professional help over. Even if you feel like your mind is an uncomfortable place to spend some time, that's such a great cue just to become more curious about the conditions that are causing that. Inside of your mind, and find somebody professionally who can help you out in a situation like that. Uh, what I find in my own life is that anxiety is almost always subclinical. It pervades what you do, and you often only notice it when it breaks through that conscious barrier to become evident to you through something that happens in your own life. Maybe you're going through a really stressful period at work, and you find it difficult to focus because you're so bound up that it's impossible to do so. Maybe it's something like giving a presentation and you can't think about anything else all week. Um, but I think the modern anxiety that we face is subtle, and it affects us in these subtle ways that are incremental, but those increments can prove profound in practice. One of those ways is our working memory capacity. This is the part of our mind that we use to be creative all day long. We use this, our working memory capacity is just our short term, immediate term mental scratch pad. And if I were to ask you to multiply 12 by 32 in your head, if you're able to do so, you might close your eyes and visualize carrying the one, and how you do that is by using your working memory capacity. And anxiety, when we're experiencing a subclinical level of it, we it takes us about, our working memory shrinks by about 20%. And you might think, okay, whatever. The 20%, it's not a lot. But if you extrapolate that over the course of the day, 8 hours of work now takes us around 10 hours to get through. And if you schedule 8 hours each day, you might find yourself working overtime. You might find yourself, not being present in what you're doing, or just kind of scrolling through social media, and finding that you're busier, but you're less productive and that you have less time than before. The cause of that is anxiety. And the fascinating thing about that I found in my own life that was actually very difficult to wade through is there is a point where anxiety becomes comfortable,
Mhm.
where we start to, and it's this familiarity bias. So the more we encounter a piece of information that is familiar, the more comfortable we become with it, and the more we see it as something that furthers our goals primitively, right? We
Mhm.
see it primitively even though it doesn't. And so by the 500th time we go to the news website of our choosing, it becomes just a part of our day, and we don't really realize the effect it has on our mind anymore. And when stress becomes comfortable, anxiety becomes comfortable because it's ingrained within the habits, the tapestry of our day. And so, the level of clinical anxiety that exists above this subclinical level of anxiety is not something that I cover in the book, though these techniques have been proven in the research to help with that, though that's not my area of expertise. Uh, I do think it's worth deconstructing the parts of our working environment that make us significantly less present and productive in these subtle ways that produce these incremental results that are profound, in how much less they make us productive. It's tough with awareness because you notice the delta when you improve, but you don't always notice the delta when you don't. So if your energy, is, let's say you eat like a big Indian buffet for lunch every day next week, and you have 75% of the energy that you usually do, um, you might not notice that actually, because you can still project an air of productivity to your evaluating part of your mind that you're productive in the form of busyness. Our mind can't distinguish between busyness and genuine progress. But if you care about creating work that makes a difference, you're going to want that extra 25% to be able to bring as much as you possibly can of yourself to whatever it is that you're doing. Because ultimately, like that, productivity is about intention, but with the goal of optimizing the benefits and the contributions of our work. It's so we can do work that makes a difference. And the things that affect our productivity in subtle ways are not sexy. Calm is less sexy than 2xing your productivity, but A, it's actually based in research, so it's not bullshit. But B, we actually feel different and more present, and like we can enjoy our work and make a bigger difference and become present with whatever it is that we're doing. I think there's beauty in that. Work, especially when we do creative work. And this is something that again came up a lot in the research, is values, right? This is whenever I do creative work, which I consider my books to be, when we feel like we're manifesting our values through our actions, that's what meaning is. That's what meaning is. It's manifested values through action. And if we can connect that with that each and every day, we're going to feel pretty fired up.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pull on that creativity thread a little bit, because
Yeah.
values through action is, I think that is very, very elegant. When we apply ourselves, what I guess, help me unpack and understand the difference between and why creative work gives us juice, whereas grindy work that is just
Yeah.
ticking a box, especially if it's ticking a box for somebody else, can leave us feeling empty. And
Hmm.
maybe the spectrum or the journey to burnout might
Yeah.
be, different in length for creative work.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for an argument, if there is one in here, that,
Yeah.
how the value of creative work.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's an incredible value in creating something out of nothing. That's what moves the world forward. That's what creates culture. And, creation for creation's sake is most definitely a value. And there are these basic values that we have. There's 10, and I have a list. I'm cheating. I pulled these up as you were asking the question. There's 10 basic values, though. And this was a theory of value from Saul Schwartz. And he found that depending on how conservative versus, well, so there's kind of two spectrums, how conservative we are versus whether we want things to improve or be different, and whether we're focused on improving ourselves or others. And so there are 10 basic values. So self-direction is most definitely one we feel as though we can manifest through creation. That's the first value. Stimulation is a value. Hedonism, achievement is another value. Power is a value. Security, conformity, tradition, benevolence, and universalism. So we all kind of have a different gradient of values. But when we're doing work that's creative, there are some values that are more universal and held by more people, and others that are held by fewer people. So power is an example of something that isn't really held by as many people as something like self-direction. This idea of independent thought and action, this idea of creation. And so, if we look to what fires us up, it's definitely the act of creation and being able
Yeah.
to express this self-direction through whatever it is that we're doing. But with burnout, the fascinating thing about burnout is how much fluff there is about it. So when I burnt out in my own work, when I hit this wall of anxiety and exhaustion, cynicism, and being unproductive, I looked to a lot of the books on burnout out there, but I didn't learn as much as I did through the actual research articles on burnout. You can read a few journal articles about a topic and sometimes discover more about that topic than you can through two or three books on that. And I found
Yeah.
burnout to be the a phenomenon kind of like that, even though there's so much in the zeitgeist about this idea. And full credit where credit is due. Christina Maslach has been studying burnout for decades, and
She must be burnt out on that.
yeah, she's
Ah.
probably so sick of talking about it. Fascinating thing about her is the Stanford prison experiment.
Oh yeah. Well.
Um, so nobody, when it was running, kind of questioned its morality, but she visited at some point within the experiment, and she said, "This has to stop. There's no way, or this can't continue like it is." And she told Philip Zimbardo, who was running the experiment, that it had to end, and she ended the Stanford prison experiment.
Wow.
And she actually went on to marry Philip Zimbardo, maybe. maybe she was thinking, okay, he can't. Let's make sure he doesn't do another.
I'm going to stick
No, I
with this
don't.
guy for a long. Yeah.
Yeah, seriously, I got to watch over this fella. Um, but interestingly, a decade or two after that, she would go on to make what I consider to be the largest contributions in the field of burnout research, including the Maslach burnout inventory, which is the most commonly used instrument for measuring burnout. And what she found in her research is that there's six main areas of our work that lead us. Again, remember, burnout is the spectrum. Burnout on one side, engagement, presence on the other. And the more of these factors that are in alignment with who we are and what we're doing, the more engaged we are and the less burnt out we are. The first one is workload. And so the more work we have on our plate, the more likely we are to burn out. When we have a bit more work than we have time to do it in, that creates a phenomenon called time pressure, which is another interesting idea that is a whole other rabbit hole or whatever you call it, black hole of discussion. But but workload, limiting workload is the most commonly given clinical intervention when somebody's diagnosable as burnt out. So workload. But if it's roughly aligned to how much you have a capacity for, you feel engaged. Lack of control is another one. So the less control you feel you have over your work, the more likely you are to be burnt out. But again, when we do creative work, we have that fire under us. We have control over what we do often, usually how we do it, the vantage point we have, the approach we take. We can bring our own unique spin to it, which is amazing. And often we define our own workload, which helps in that factor. Reward is the third factor. This is financial reward, but it's also being recognized for the work that we do. So reward is the third factor. Community is the fourth factor. So whether we feel like we can connect with the people that we work closely with, with creative work, there's often more of a sense of community. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the work is more solo. So that might move you closer to the burnout side of the spectrum. Fairness is the fifth factor. So whether we're treated fairly, whether our work is appraised fairly, and values is actually the sixth factor. So the more we can feel like we're manifesting our values through our action, the more meaningful work becomes, the less likely we are to burn out, the more likely we are to be engaged. And so with creative work, you can kind of run down that list. We have more control. We can manifest these creative values through our actions. We can often find this sense of community. And so it's no wonder that we feel so fired up when we're doing it, and, it's interesting because creative work is often more aversive at the same time, and so we procrastinate a bit more on it often too. So it works against engagement in that way, but it's this interesting concoction when it comes to burnout.
Mm. And yeah, that is one of the reasons I was really inspired and interested in your work, because of the impact that it has on our each of our creative capacities and the creative community at large. Uh, to that end,
Yeah.
there's you talk in the book about savoring,
Yeah.
and to me this is sort of you talk at length about the research and the science behind it.
Yeah.
I'm I identify with the human experience, the empirical experience of like a great sip of red wine, or an amazing taste of food, or a moment. I have confessed that I got a little puppy, a new puppy in the house, and
Oh, when? As of
yes,
when?
as of he's been in our household for 7 weeks, and he is
Oh.
15 weeks old, so he's just a little
Oh,
sweetheart.
man.
His name's Bodie. But I have, this the ability to savor this little moment. Like,
Mhm.
I was walking behind him this morning, pitch black, raining, didn't care because his little butt was just so cute. And it just, it made me, thinking in advance of our conversation and the role that savoring moments,
Yeah.
um, there's something beautiful about,
Yeah.
this awareness and this how we can use savoring to be more present, to enjoy life more,
Yeah.
and in a way to sort of as an antidote to all this anxiety that
Yeah.
we find ourselves swimming in sometimes.
Well, this was one of the most delightful research fields I encountered in writing this book. And, savoring is the science of converting a positive experience into positive emotions. And I love that definition so much because just because we experience something positive doesn't mean we'll derive any satisfaction from it whatsoever. You have people who live these lives that look so amazing on the surface, but yet they're miserable because they can't savor the things that are actually present in their lives. And then you then meet somebody who's maybe a bit less living a bit less of a luxurious life, but they wake up and they make a cup of coffee and it's like that cup, it's like they've won the lottery when they take the first sip. And then they spend the morning with their puppy, their kitten. We actually just got a kitten 2 weeks
Oh,
ago. Her name's
nice.
Eleanor. So
Oh, how
I'm so
precious.
excited. Named
Precious.
after Eleanor who won the first Nobel Prize in economics, because my wife is a professor of economics. But savoring is this beautiful art, and there's so many different types of it too. There's luxuriating in an experience, which a cat and a puppy does beautifully. Actually,
Yeah,
they
right.
luxuriate quite a bit. There's Thanksgiving, right? Giving thanks, feeling gratitude for everything that we have. There's marveling at something, just being in awe of something. So there's so many different forms of savoring. We can even savor the past or the future. And so when we savor the past, anything, how does that work? Isn't savoring? But they count as savoring because we do it in the present moment.
Mhm.
When we savor the past, it's called reminiscence, right? Of
Mm.
course,
Yeah.
we're recalling a beautiful memory, a sunset that we saw, a conversation we had, a meal we had. Looking through photos is one of my favorite ways of doing this, and we can savor the future. So something that is upcoming. So that's called anticipation. So we can count down the days to an event, and the research shows that actually counting down the days to an event leads us to savor the actual event more, because doing so leads us to develop effective memory traces in our mind that we paint over with the experience that we eventually have. And so
Mm.
this art of savoring, all you have to do is make a list of all the things in your life that you love to enjoy. And here's the fascinating thing: the wealthier somebody is, the less likely they are to have a savoring ability. Savoring is actually a skill we can get better at. So, in other words, we can get better at deriving satisfaction from our everyday experiences in our life. And I think there's such beauty in that. One of my favorite things to ask somebody when I meet them for the first time is, what do you savor the most? And I found that truth from the research, that wealthier people report a lower savoring ability, really does hold true. And this is an experiment that anybody can conduct. Ask the well-off people versus the people who are less well-off what they savor the most, and chances are the ones who are less well-off will enjoy their actual lives more. And
Mm.
it's kind of this irony that comes from this mindset of more, where we're always craving more of what we have, where our life is centered around dopamine instead of that presence. This is the chemical underpinning of that less ability to savor something. And scarcity also leads us to savor something more. If you have two pieces of chocolate versus four, you're going to enjoy the two pieces of chocolate more per unit than you would that four, because you have that scarcity. If you like chips or something, try as an experiment, 1 hour, just set aside 5 chips and see how much you enjoy them. Then the next hour, have the rest of the bag and see how much you enjoy it. Chances are you're gonna report a lowering savory ability. But just make a list of everything you love to savor: the puppies in your life, the cats in your life, the board games, the people, the walks around town, the lattes that you love, the drinks you love, the meals you love. For me, usually comes down to food and people. That's just probably how my mind works. But savoring is a shortcut to presence. And the better we become at savoring stuff, the more engaged we become. And you don't have to worry. Your goals will be waiting for you on the other side of enjoying things. And the activity actually leads you to become more present and more engaged with what you do, regardless of whether you luxuriate or marvel or reminisce or anticipate something. There is beauty, like just profound beauty, but also these practical, tangible benefits to enjoying life that are just great, just incredible.
Mm. All right. You said something. This is
Oh,
really the last topic
oh,
that I want to
what
excavate.
would I say?
You said something that I find fascinating because there's tension, and this is the beautiful thing about being human, right? Is we can something can be true, and and we can have multiple interpretations of an event. For example,
Yeah,
being human is complex, and so it is in this complexity that I'm sort of I located around this idea of productivity. So productivity, there's a line in some of the marketing materials for your book that talk about how productivity advice works and
yeah,
how we need it more than ever, but it's vital that we develop our capacity for calm. So
yeah,
there's an inherent tension here.
yeah,
And when I hear in your words the value of presence,
yeah,
I want to understand the relationship between presence and I'll just use maybe it's a little bit trite, but sort of the human being versus the human doing.
yeah.
And so if as a productivity expert, what you're
Mhm.
advocating for is calm and presence,
Yeah,
how is that not antithetical? So help me
yeah,
understand the relationship there.
yeah. Well, presence is the process through which we actually become productive. Right? If
Mm,
you're trying to do something, if your intention is to do something, and we all have moments like this where we intend to, edit 500 photos or, weed through an article that we're writing or do anything that's creative. Often we can't muster the presence to do that. We can't show up. Our mind is resisting the task, maybe because it's at a lower stimulation height, whatever the reason, right? And the fact of the matter is presence is what productivity is all about, right? That
mm,
is where the rubber meets the road. And so much, I'd say 70, 80, maybe even 90% of productivity, maybe 80% of productivity advice is about cultivating the conditions for presence. It's about managing your time, your attention, your energy, which I consider to be the three main ingredients with productivity. It's managing those in a way that you cultivate the conditions to be able to show up to whatever it is that you intend to do. And so presence is what productivity is all about. There is, this culture that we have, this hustling culture that I'm personally really not a fan of, especially looking at a lot of the proper research on calm and productivity. When we do work with our minds rather than with our hands, hustling becomes significantly less important and can be even detrimental to our overall intentions, right? Because we push ourselves to do more, 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 faster, faster, faster. Again, instead of doing the right things deliberately and with intention and calmly, not constantly looking for threats around us, not in this fray of activity where we hope to eke out some productivity amidst our immense fray of busyness, right? And it goes back to how we think about our productivity in the first place. Because one of the truths about productivity is we are terrible at measuring how productive we are, and we tend to look at proxy measures like how exhausted am I at the end of the day. Oh, if I'm exhausted, I must have been productive. Or how busy was I today? Even if I just answered email all day long, if I was busy, I must be productive, right? But intentionality, the intentions that we set every day, and also, before we do something, those should be the benchmark against which we measure
Mm,
our progress towards productivity.
mm,
And presence is all, intention and presence work together in beautiful ways. Intention kind of hands the baton to presence, and then we hunker down on something. And productivity books, productivity advice is great. And I really do think we need it more than ever, because we need to have these conditions to be able to cultivate this presence. But if you have the ability to be present with whatever it is that you intend to do, you never have to pick up a book on productivity. Maybe unless you want to decide what to be productive on in the first place, right? The 10, 20, 30% of other advice. But the rest of productivity is about cultivating our capacity for progress, right?
mm,
And that's what
mm,
presence is, where the rubber meets the road on that.
mm. I love that. That made me lean into, the idea in a world that has bathed itself in hustle,
Yeah.
the ability to be present. And I think, I'm reminded of, you know, the effectiveness, say, of monks in, creating elaborate drawings in the sand, or stacking
Mm.
pebbles, or, any, n number of tasks that they're, when they're so present and focused, seems uh like no one ever, or I guess in this moment, this idea of like accusing a monk of not being productive when they're in their their Zen state.
Yeah.
I don't have the experience of hearing people, watch them do those things.
Yeah.
Well, the ideas that struck me as so profound, that the busyness is actually, more of a disease, and not really
Hmm.
a fake proxy, as you talked about. This idea of um, of 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 connection to the work, of savoring, to me,
Yeah.
is incredibly valuable. Um, my goal with our conversation today was to help the creator, the entrepreneurial audience, the people who identify as such, that are listening to the show right now, understand and resonate with the value of calm. I know that the
Yeah.
more comfortable in my own skin that I become, the calmer I feel. This sort of, it's almost like a tractor beam, instead of, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. But
Yeah.
I wanted to personally thank you for putting your work out into the world, and helping make the case for a calmer, kinder, and, based on your definition here, ultimately more productive human experience. So,
Oh,
thank you. And this is, the last thing that I will ask on our way out is: are there elements of your book, how to calm your mind, finding presence and productivity in anxious times? Is there anything that we didn't talk about
mhm.
today that is in your book that you really feel like, hey Chase, your people need to know this before we
Oh,
sign off?
well, it's tough, because when you zoom out from a topic like calm and look at what affects it, pretty much everything affects calm. And so,
Yeah,
that was one of the challenges of writing this book, is when so many factors of our life influence how calm or anxious or burnt out or engaged we are. How do you zero in on the ones that actually make the most progress, lead
yeah,
us to make the most progress in the directions that we want? And I tried to center the book around what was counterintuitive, but maybe just one that we haven't focused on. Just a quickie is to mind the time you spend in the digital versus analog worlds. And so much of creation now is digital. I do pretty much all of my creation in the digital world. whether it's creating an email or whether it's writing a book. But I would mind the different activities you do in each, because there's kind of a Venn diagram of sorts you can make with the analog only activity circle and the digital only activity circle. And where they meet in the middle are these activities you can do in both worlds. The analog only ones are like brushing your teeth and going on a walk through nature and really experiencing the benefits. The digital only ones are like typing an email and I don't know, reading the digital news. But in the middle, that I think is the area worth focusing on in bringing more activities into your analog world. On average, we spend 13 to 13.5 hours every day looking at screens of the 16 or 17 hours that we're properly awake. That is too much, in my opinion,
Yeah,
especially
yeah,
when you look at what allows us to achieve calm and achieve a presence with what we're doing. That's too damn high. And
yeah.
so anything that you can do in the analog world that lives at the middle of that Venn diagram, whether that's journaling, doing that in an analog way with a fancy fountain pen, maybe. It could be keeping your daily to-do list. It could be playing games instead of, swapping out your video games for a board game night with friends that you're playing with online anyway. It could be, we all have activities in the middle of this Venn diagram that we can bring into our analog lives and find that meaning. In my opinion, the digital world exists to make our lives more efficient, and the analog world exists to make our lives more meaningful. And so you won't just get to experience the slowness of these tasks; you'll also get to feel the meaning behind them too.
Mm. Beautiful, beautiful way of wrapping up. Thank you very much. Yeah, I remember your TED talk that I was watching prior to us recording today. Starts off with how much screen time, and that is
Yeah,
a startling,
yeah, right
startling
on.
number. But wow, didn't need to know that. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, talk
Um,
about guilt.
that's right.
you know,
That's right. So hopefully you're not watching this. Hopefully you're listening to it and doing some other things with
that's
your
right.
hands um, in an analog world. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show, Chris, and for the work that you've done around helping us calm our mind. Again, most recent book, How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Presence and Productivity in Anxious Times. Thanks again for being on the show. Aside from directing people to the book, is there somewhere else where I may direct their attention, or where you can take this moment to share with our community of listeners and watchers where you'd like our
Yeah,
attention?
yeah. The book is, in my opinion, and I'm totally biased. I think it's the best thing I've ever created, and it's also the most personal thing I've ever created. And I think you'll find it helpful. So yeah, I hope you consider picking. You don't have to, but I hope you consider doing so.
You must.
You must. Yeah, I demand on high. So the book is called How to Calm Your Mind, and my website is chrisbailey.com. And I also do a podcast with my wife called Time and Attention. And so you can check that out too. No pressure, but I hope
Sweet.
you'll join.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. So, from Chris and I, he hailing from Canada and me from
Ooh.
essentially South Canada. I'm in Seattle today. We both bid you have a good day and adieu. Until next time.